Hey everyone, Aaron Lelito here to introduce our new podcast episode. This one is an interview with an artist named Ashley Pryor Geiger, and she has a piece that's included in our January issue. That piece is called Threshold, and if you take a look at our website on the podcast page, I reposted that piece, so it's easy to see if you're listening. And the website there is wildroofjournal.com/podcast. So you can take a peek at the digital collage that she had included in the issue. And we do talk about it specifically closer to the end of our conversation. Ashley is mainly a digital collagist among some other types of artwork that she does. And in addition, she's a professor of philosophy. Ashley and I actually share a couple of experiences in our own creative journeys, oddly enough, and we share a Great Lake. We live at separate ends or opposite ends of Lake Erie, as it turns out as well. Ashley's based out of Toledo, Ohio. I hope you enjoy the conversation we have, and if you're a returning listener, thanks. Can't say thanks enough for checking us out, and if you've come back, hopefully gives you more of what you found appealing about the first episodes that you heard. And if you're a new listener and you like what you hear in this episode, we do have 3 other episodes up at this point. 2 of them are interviews, similar to this, and 1 is a roundtable discussion where we pick some favorites that we've published here and do a little bit of analyzing and interpretation and talk about what we liked about them. To give you a little bit of behind the scenes, I'm in talks with Chris Vogt, who was one of the participants in the roundtable discussion. So he may be a return guest on a future roundtable. My people are in touch with his people, all that kind of stuff. Kidding aside. Plans are in the works for kind of continuing these generally at the beginning of every month. Hope you check back with us, and for now, enjoy the discussion. So if you would, give a brief self-introduction and let everybody know who you are.
Sure. I'm Ashley Pryor Geiger. I am a digital artist with a sort of a special interest in collage. I do a little analog collage as well. I'm from the Rust Belt in Toledo, Ohio. I'm also an academic. I'm an associate professor of the humanities at the Jessup Scott Honors College at University of Toledo.
Okay, nice. So really what I'd like to start with is just to get a little bit of sense of more or less your creative journey so far, at least, and maybe even like a formative experience that you might look back on as something that was important.
Sure. So my first academic love was art history. I remember my mother for Valentine's Day giving me, and it felt random at the time, and I have to confess I was a little upset because it wasn't chocolates or something. She gave me a book on the American artist John Singleton Copley. But I was fascinated with it and just asked for more and more art books and just couldn't get enough of them. And I was really lucky at my high school that I had opportunities to do advanced, AP level work at the Cleveland Museum of Art, which is one of the national treasures. Another great fortune in my life has been to live in areas with really outstanding art museums. The Toledo Museum of Art, who would think, is really one of the great national treasures. So in any case, I really first started with an academic interest, although like lots of kids, I think I was always coloring but at some point really fell into the trap of art is, you have to dedicate your life to be an artist, and I just never considered myself an artist in my early years, even with this intense art history background. So, sort of fast forward, through my life, I've always done sort of craft type things and some art things too. Through my interest in art history, I learned about the Fluxus movement. Artists like in music, John Cage, in dance, Merce Cunningham, in visual arts, of course, Yoko Ono, and Ray Johnson, who started a school of correspondence art. And that was my first real vehicle of sort of where I began to think, I am kind of a bit of an artist. I would send things out in a sort of anonymous way through this informal, slightly anarchic group of correspondence artists. And my moniker at the time was Miss Maps. So there's some stuff still from those days that I would send out, really as a mechanism for stress release. So, about 5 years ago, I got an iPad, and my digital art practice really began, frankly, with just experimenting with filters on family photos, and then just continuously pushing that effect until the point that it had very little resemblance to the original. And I just really honestly kept building my skills from there. And so then realized that that I could cut things out, reassemble, and that they started to look a lot like some of the collage artists that I had admired for years. So it was really a little bit accidental, but now it is a primary obsession. I have a very robust daily practice, and it was really through that, just day after day, working on skills, that I fully embraced the title artist. That and frankly, the encouragement of my husband, who said, if you're doing this every day, you really should start sending things out. And he's a poet, and so he gave me guidance on where to start sending work out.
Nice. Yeah, there's a lot there we can get into. You mentioned the correspondence art, going back a little bit.
Mhm.
What is that exactly?
Sure. Well, I mean, it's basically creating artworks on that get sent through the mail. There's nothing more sophisticated than that. At the time, I had this incredible, and I still do somewhere in a box in the basement, this amazing array of rubber stamps. Again, I sort of felt like, oh, I don't have a foundation in drawing. So what do I do? How do I express myself creatively? And the rubber stamping, in a way, is when I look back, is kind of a natural seed for what I do now digitally. But I would use sort of analog collage techniques, scraps of paper, found things, manipulated rubber stamps, because you can cut them and reassemble them. And it's really about the exterior. It's not so much about what is, you can often send things even without something on the inside, but it's just the idea of sort of spontaneous expression sent through the mail, and to allow the sort of marking and accidental aspect of the U.S. Postal Service. So that's what it is. And Ray Johnson was the one who sort of coined the term for this practice. And in fact, he plays around with the spelling, so it's correspondence.
Nice. That's there are some parallels. I feel like in some of the things you mentioned and some of my own experiences. But yeah, that's something I'm not quite familiar with. Maybe feel like I've heard about it maybe a couple of times, but yeah, it's an interesting entry point. Yeah, because like you mentioned, it doesn't maybe feel like you're making something that has to be seen by a lot of people, or that has to be like art with a capital A or something.
Right. And I think something that will emerge from our discussion is I have a very democratic, kind of anarchic sensibility that underlies a lot of it. I think a lot about my own experience, about being hesitant to even think about myself as an artist. So I love practices like this that are also that just are really about art can be found in the everyday, and to embrace the element of surprise and to get out of your head, which is the same advice for writers too, I think, many times.
Yes, exactly. So I know that I think of myself a little bit. If I think back far enough, my main interest creatively was writing and doing maybe short fiction. I guess these days it might be called flash fiction or microfiction.
Yeah.
And that's one of the main transition points for me is when I eventually, through a series of events and kind of other people's influence, got into more of the visual art, which was so much more freeing. And a lot of times when you're maybe outside of an area where you think you should have maybe an expertise or you do have an academic background, when you get outside of that, you realize that things come a lot maybe more easy in terms of tuning into some kind of creativity that you don't get so bogged down with it's got to be like this or it's got to be like that or trying to do something premeditated maybe.
Yeah, I mean, I so identify with what you said. I mean, our lives are, at least mine, is so full of oughts and shoulds. And so I love having, and I need to have a practice that is as limitless in its possibilities as possible. And I often find if I have to write something now, sometimes I can't quite express what I want to in writing, and so having a visual arts practice too can be very helpful to my writing. So sometimes it's actually only through manipulation of like images that I find an outline for what I need to say, and vice versa. There's some things I can't I can't quite figure out visually that I can in writing. And so it can be a very mutually beneficial relationship.
Sure, yeah, absolutely. And that's kind of was one of my initial taking off points was the combination of the two, which obviously, if anybody is listening and looked through the Wild Rift Journal kind of mindset,
Hmm.
that's one of the main things that I've used as kind of one of the themes, a loose theme. But yeah, you mentioned the daily art practice. Can you describe that a little bit? Like what is it the same every day? Is it more of a pattern that you go through, or is it just a set amount of time?
Yeah. Well, it's hmm, it can look different on different days, but one of the things again that some people just absolutely poo-poo is that I am very active on Instagram. And it's really because there's a built-in arts community there that do these sort of digital challenges, where someone will host an image and then we all go at it. And by the end of the week, there's like a selection process. And so I always participate in those. And again, for me, it's as much like problem solving. So that's sort of already a built-in kind of practice of accountability almost, because we all expect each other's work at a certain point, and there are multiple challenges. Sometimes I will also have a more focused project, and I'm actually, cross your fingers for me, everyone, due for a sabbatical after like 10 years. So I think that's happening in the fall. And so I do have some lined up projects, sort of a more thematic, systematic construct that I will begin to schedule. But I do not allow myself to go to bed at night until I have done something with digital arts. I should say, actually, I give myself one allowance. I also am a very avid improvisational theater person. So sometimes on those nights when I do a performance or I'm in a class, I allow myself to go to bed before posting something.
I think that's fair. That counts as a creative output. I would say. Um, it's probably beneficial not to, you need structure in a daily practice, obviously, but it's beneficial not to be not too loose and not too tight, as they say.
Hmm.
Um, Speaking of the Instagram posts you do, a lot of I guess the source material is different types of old photography, and I'll link to your Instagram account also when I do post this, so people can get a selection. But yeah, where does that come from? Where does the actual images come from?
Yeah, they come from all over the place as long as they're fair use, right? But most particularly, a lot of the images come from the Tulane University Digital Archives. I was really lucky to be selected as a participant in Collage Magazine's Collage Institute this summer. And Tulane University and kind of gave us free reign of their archives. And so a lot of the vintage photography is from that collection, and including the one that was featured in Wild Roof. So that's a favorite source. One of the current obsessions I have is with a project called History Made Up. And that is one of those that's I'm really hoping to finalize for a show in the fall. But it's basically using vintage photography of women in particular, but not limited to women, running them through AI apps and then doing the kinds of like finishing work. But I'm fascinated with how these interventions really change reception of women. I mean, particularly fascinating is when like you run Lucretia Mott through, like an early feminist through this AI app, how very different the reception is. And I think that just opens up very interesting questions about assumptions about how very different people were in the past, or how unlike them, or how liberated we are, et cetera. And I would like to do more with my sort of academic interests with historical accounts and other archival work to support that.
You mentioned that putting an old. I want to have a few questions about these old photos, but what do you? How does it work with that AI? Is it like it's pre-programmed to do something with the image, and you're not quite sure how it's going to turn out, or like what's the? How does it affect an original old photograph?
Yeah. So this is sort of a feminist concern I've had that motivated this project to begin with. I mean, I have friends even, and I'm in my 50s, who are running scenarios of their faces through these makeup apps that, not only show you like how much better you could look with a little lipstick, but also I think very perniciously sometimes are always linked to products. So it's not just that you run your face through it, but like, and here's where you buy it. And of course, young people too are using this. So I'm always experimenting with things. I'm fascinated with all these apps, both in a positive way and a negative way. So I ran a couple, just on a whim, a couple of, I think I was working with some Library of Congress images. And I was just like, well, let's see what happens. Will it work on these old photos? And it weirdly does. So, it will, you can select different looks, and the way the algorithms work, they know where to put the lipstick. So it looks like it's, belongs there, and the eyeshadow, and you can even do hair. Now it's not perfect, and this is where the hand of an artist, if you want to call this part of my work artistic, the sort of further manipulation to make it as natural as looking as possible comes in. Where I think the real artistry or the artistic sensibility comes in with the project is these larger questions about what this kind of technology means, and how it continues to shape our identities. And again, this question about how does it change our reception of these historical figures?
Yeah, there's a lot of interesting things going on there. That's pretty fascinating. Yeah, just the concept overall, I'd be interested to see some examples. Yeah. Is the 2-lane archives you mentioned, is that something that is open access, or is that something that's through like a university database or something?
No, I mean it is. It's really open access. So you just, if you just Google Tulane University archives, I love it, and more universities, and of course museums too, are opening their collection, which is just a field day for digital artists and collagists in particular, because we're borrowing so heavily from past sources and then bringing our own imagery in too. But yeah, I encourage people to go there. I loved, in particular, there's a collection in the archive by a turn of the century, sort of high society photographer named Joseph Pops Witzel. And what's interesting to me is the collection is actually scans of his glass negatives. And what that means is that there are just these incredible textures to them, and often not burn marks, but just corrosion. So the materials haven't held up, but so there's already a really fascinating effect. And so they'd be quite useless to many people, but for me, they're gold, because they're often very disturbing. So people's heads could be halfway cracked off, or it looks like they have a huge lesion on their neck. So it's just very fun to work around, and also just the constraints. I think one of the things I have discovered is that it's almost like sonnet writing or something. When you have a very strict form, sometimes that really opens up more avenues for creativity as you have real obstacles or challenges to work with.
Sure, and that's true in maybe just the using a more specific form, but it also reminds me of what you said earlier, kind of working with the limitations, or maybe working around the limitations, even just artistically. So, if somebody says, well, I can't draw or I can't paint, but I could try to figure out something, either, it doesn't mean it's a lesser art or something, because, maybe a photographer isn't able to draw very well or something, but it's, working with what you're interested in and using certain forms of art that complement that over other ones. So I think that's kind of an interesting, I guess, a path for different artists in terms of what they're drawn to, and using what's available. Kind of a resourcefulness, I think, is an important part of the creative process in a lot of ways. There's a practicality to it that doesn't always get talked about with creativity.
Yeah. I don't mean to interrupt, sorry, but it's just what you said so resonates. I mean, I think that one of the reasons, I speculate here, but one of the reasons for this might be that we are still so wedded to this notion of the artist as genius from, like, really I think that was the height of romanticism. That's where we really got this idea of the artist genius, often with a writer or visual artist working in isolation in some godforsaken garret. I think when we start exploring the accidental in art, and really thinking of it as a problem-solving technique, it really problematizes that idea, right? And so, while there is an artist responding and working with the materials, we see that the materiality already has this artistry within too. I just think it's a very disruptive practice in that way, and I know I love it for that reason. That once I start thinking of it more as, like, okay, so this is a problem to be solved, and there are multiple ways to solve it. But here, when I'm dealing more with chance, and I allow things from the outside to be part of the practice, that's when I have the most satisfying process, and often, to my mind, the best result.
Absolutely. I don't know if my idea on this is super accurate, but I mean, the genius idea you mentioned, I think maybe even it carries on today where we think of like, oh, that person is a genius, and it's like something that we see like within a person. But previously, I don't know how far back you got to go to it. It was something that was without. It was something that genius is something outside that is funneled through a person. Um, and I think there's something to that idea, or I don't have, maybe first hand experience with what that's like or something. Other than, I mean, I guess you could just say like you're just saying the intuitive nature of it, where you could say, well, that's just something inside me that's coming out by chance, or you could say that's something that has been kind of filtered through what I'm putting out there, with whatever which creative output you're working with. Does that make any sense?
Oh, it sure does. And it actually recalls there's a delightful and much neglected Platonic dialogue called the Ion. And there it's a discussion with Socrates in kind of early Socrates form, meaning he's just really asking questions. You get less doctrine. It doesn't end with a conclusive answer, but it's really about the nature of artistry. And this character Ion, who writes tragedies, is definitely advocating for this sort of divine inspiration where he is sort of a vessel and doesn't know under Socratic questioning, like, where do you come up with this and how do you know it's art and all these kinds of things. So yes, I mean, we like all ideas, this idea of the artist has evolved through time, and I think we're actually in a really interesting spot. Again, with contemporary concerns about more public art, participatory artwork, and engagement with the community. I think we're working through another iteration of what it means to be an artist. I hope.
Yeah, sure. I haven't quite considered it going in that direction, but yeah, that's a good point. I know. I just one of the thought experiments I always just kind of like to wonder about without I guess getting to the answer. But yeah, just like where does the idea come from? Like how did I come up with that? So I just always love that kind of the unexplained nature of it, and personally, I guess I'm willing to just leave it unexplained. I like the mystery of it. Maybe that's too much of a cop out.
Oh, yeah.
But yeah, it does make a lot of sense, at least with what I've done with some digital art pieces that I've done. What else? You mentioned you use certain apps for the digital processing or the digital editing.
Mm-hmm.
Have you come across ones you like or that are able to be accessed if there's listeners out there who are either photographers or want to explore?
Sure.
Ones that you would recommend?
Sure. I would say like my two like can't live without apps are Procreate and iColorama. Procreate is I think it was first conceived mostly for people who are doing digital painting. And the great advantage to Procreate is like Photoshop, you work in layers. And Photoshop, I understand. I don't do any work really, and I have basic skills in Photoshop. Procreate has a wonderful array of built-in brushes so that you can paint onto images, stamp onto images, as well as like compositional tools. So, this is where I do the most of my manipulations with like cutting things out and reassembling. It also has features like liquefy, so you can, really change the shape, liquefy, warp, all that kind of thing. So I really love it, and I love too that it has a community of people who make their own brushes. You can make your own brush. You can share them freely or you can charge for them. So it's just it's just fascinating, just ever growing community. So I love that. And there's a nice discussion board. So if anyone wants to check that out, if you just like look up Procreate discussion board, you'll see people sharing tips, tutorials. It's really lovely. I wish all of the world worked like that.
Yeah.
um, iColorama is another wonderful app. It's a little bit more. It has all sorts of tools too. It's a little bit more of a closed system. That's not to say that there aren't also people who share work and tips on iColorama, but it has some more. It has more of the stamp of the initial programmer to it. But there are things I can do in iColorama that I can't do in Procreate, and it goes back to that sort of discussion of limitations. So sometimes I really want to do things in iColorama because I'm limited in a way that I might not be in Procreate. So it really helps me think through some things. And there are also some effects that I haven't figured out how to do in Procreate that I know I can do. So I would say for anyone interested in sort of moving from these standalone apps where, like I talked about the makeup app or something like that, if you're really beginning to want to make more complex images, I would really check out those too. I think that they're the best, unless Photoshop is always an option. I confess, I just felt very intimidated by it's a very I find Photoshop a very linear interface, and it's very complicated. Even though they've done a ton over the years to do tutorials, so I know everything can be done in Photoshop. I'm not proficient. I'm not comfortable in Photoshop in the way I am in these other interfaces.
Sure. Yeah. And I've never, is this like a confession if people are making it this way through? I've never used Photoshop, like the official, I've used other photo editing software, of course, but yeah, so that it's good to know there's some other options out there. And yeah, if you look up, even if you're thinking of photo editing programs, even if you just look up open source photo editors, there's plenty of, or at least a couple that I know of that are good options.
What do you use, Aaron? What's your go-to?
That's my secret. But it's actually a pretty well-known one called GIMP. GIMP.
Yeah, I was just going to mention them.
So that's a good open source photo editing program, and they do have updates pretty regularly. And it's similar to a Photoshop, I suppose. There is a learning curve. It's not the most intuitive program to just like open up and start doing stuff. But there's YouTube tutorials which are helpful. So it does take a little bit of learning to kind of figure out if you haven't used a photo editing program, and if you're not familiar with how layers work and how the tools work, there's a little bit to work through. But I've used it for quite a bit now, so that's the one I would say I have the most experience with. But yeah, it's good to kind of find different avenues like that, because it's a different tool that people could use for different purposes, I guess, not just creative arts. But yeah, that's a good one. Well, along the way, you've mentioned a couple different artists that you've come across, even back to your childhood art history books. One question I usually ask is just to get either a recommendation or just maybe particular favorites in terms of maybe particular writers that you are drawn to, maybe.
Yeah.
You mentioned a couple artists already. Is there anybody you consider a favorite or a current recommendation even?
For writers, or
sure.
I can do artists and writers if you want.
Yeah. Yes, whatever you got off the top of your head.
Well, I'll talk about some. For those of you interested in sort of contemporary digital art scenes, again, these are going to be from Instagram, but I think that's a great place. There's some very high quality curated Instagram galleries. A favorite is Marco Polo Rules, which to me is sort of the premier place to find surreal contemporary and past surreal style arts. So I highly recommend it. Also, for those of you interested in collage, both analog and digital, the Paris Collage Collective is a wonderful, again, curated place, along with the Edinburgh, I think that it's Collage Collective too. So those are there. I just I just love them, and every day there's something great. As far as some artists who've sort of influenced me in the past is Romer Bearden, whose work is really interesting. He worked really, I think it was at his height probably in the 1950s, 60s. He was kind of came after Harlem Renaissance, I think was already doing some art actually at that time, but does some really beautiful collage work, really focusing on the African American experience. And also he fled to Paris for a while. So there's quite a really interesting range. And he was professor of art at Howard University. And so, like the quilt artist Lissa Butler, whose work is really coming into full prominence now, was very influenced by her time studying with him. So, check his work out. He's not, I think, known as much as he should be. I love the work of Dorothea Tanning as an early feminist surrealist, as well as Hannah Hoch. And Hannah Hoch was, of course, the godmother of collage art. So those are some must sees. I'd mentioned then Ray Johnson for correspondence art. Yoko Ono still creating amazing pieces. Can I make a shameless plug for my husband as a poet? My work is so influenced by him. I mean, I already mentioned that he was probably the first person to really encourage me to like send my work out. But I first started doing digital. I didn't share this, but his poetry, a lot of it is very nature based. Really inspired me to do a series of images early on, because he has just very concrete imagery, and I can see it in my mind in a way that I don't always, for different poetic styles, you don't always do that. So for those of you who like to have a prompt for visual imagery, you check out his work. His name's Timothy Geiger. Gosh, I read all the time, and partly for my job. So like this semester, my work is going to be on service learning in Jamaica. I'm reading a book called Children of Sisyphus right now. I work with a community in Riverton, Jamaica, that's in partnership with a group called International Samaritan. We work with communities who have historically made their living through the garbage dump that is literally in their backyard. And so there we're going to talk a lot about found art and helping build a community project there where community members can possibly create an income stream, thinking broadly about art and what they can find and what they can assemble and what they can sell. So that's really exciting. But I read
the title on that was Children of Sisyphus.
It's written by a Jamaican-born sociologist. He's now, I think, at Harvard. His last name is Patterson. I'm going to screw up his first name, so let me think about it. It'll probably come to me. But he's a sociologist, but also a very gifted writer, a novelist. So this book was actually written maybe a decade ago, but it really focuses on children who are living in those difficult conditions. I'm a philosopher. My doctorate is actually in philosophy. And so I also in my humanities class, and I mentioned Plato. My probably deepest philosophic love is Plato, particularly early Socrates. I love Mary Oliver, pretty predictable choice for the rest of the United States, right? But I do really respond to her work. I'm trying to think of who else I really love in the poetic world. I do like artists who are interested in the the non-human world, the natural world. That said, also Wallace Stevens is just a continual source of inspiration. And I shouldn't say but there because of course, there are beautiful natural images. I associate him above and beyond as poeticizing the imagination. And so I love I mean I sound like a really canonical thinker. Maybe I am, but Emily Dickinson too is just when I am at a loss for how to start an image, I often will just look at Emily Dickinson because uh, it's as much the words that she has, but the beautiful pauses and lacunas between that I find really fertile for thinking through,
Sure.
imagining. I love Clarice. Now this is another genre. I love Clarice Lispector for writing. Just she's a sort of a French philosopher novelist. I love the stories of Lydia. Now you can't.
Well, you got quite a reading list going.
The other person, I'll end with this one, but there are more. Like there, I already said you. My husband just said me.
Yeah.
I love the short. I think the master of the American short story right now, who I love the most, is Lydia Davis. Love, 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 love her. Love her work. Collected short stories of Lydia Davis. Just
Yeah.
endlessly fascinating to me. So
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
probably enough for now.
I know. Yeah. For real. There's always, and I mentioned this before, but there's always too much on a reading list to really go through it all. A lot of times you maybe pick and choose, so it's nice to have options. Um, but yeah, just for whatever reason, the one you kind of mentioned, kind of using Emily Dickinson's work for maybe purposes other than just wanting to read poetry and think about it. The one that kind of just reminded me of is HD Hilda Doolittle,
Mm.
and I've always kind of surprised if I come across one of her poems. They always find they just kind of make you just like stop for a second, like what does that mean? Because you always, at least the ones I'm thinking of that I've even used in classes, are just kind of spent a few minutes with. They're just always presented in this very kind of strange way where it's not quite clear what the meaning is supposed to be.
Mhm.
So I guess
Yeah,
that maybe sometimes does translate into like the problem solving method where you have to figure it out as a reader.
yeah. It's
Uh,
almost like a cubist. It's almost like cubism within a poem with her, isn't it? Like it's almost like looking at Cezanne. That
yeah, I think the one I was thinking of recently is it Garden? It might have been just called Garden. But yeah, but you could probably find it if you look that up. But the last thing that I did want to get to is just the image that was part of our recent issue 6, if I'm remembering that correctly, in January. It was called Threshold, and I always loved getting a little bit of a peek behind the scenes. So can you share anything? It doesn't necessarily have to be what it's supposed to mean or anything big like that, but just can you share a little bit about the origin of that, or what was a little bit about the process that maybe a viewer wouldn't know by just looking at it?
yeah, sure. Well, I really when I choose to submit, I like, of course, to really to try to get my sense of the feel and the spirit. And so with Wild Roof, I mean, what a wonderful kudos. It's a really wonderful journal, and I'm so happy to. I feel like I'm meeting an expanded cohort of artists and writers. And it seems silly sometimes to split artists and writers, like the artists. Let's just say artists. Um, so I knew I wanted to. At the time I was working with the Joseph Pops Witzel collection, I had this weird image of this baby in a bonnet with a pretty distressed look on the baby's face. And, so that baby will probably reappear in a different way with the face or something. But um, I was, again, sort of in this history made up mindset about just sort of the meaning of the past and how we receive these pictures of ridiculously dressed, over the top dressed babies from this sort of high society. But working with sort of the environmental focus and vibe of Wild Roof, I just really started playing around with, the kind of background, a vintage background that I chose that had a sort of surreal vibe, and manipulating it, to make it more that way. And this was, I would say this was an intuitive piece more than anything. So I really didn't know up until the end what was going to go in the baby's face, just that something would. And so I really finally decided it's going to be an echo of the background. And as for the cassette, I'm still trying to work that out. I mean, that is very intuitive about, I think, what I was thinking about as if this became sort of more the choice that was being made. And this is an example where I felt like it was almost being made for me. And I think I picked out a few. Sometimes I pick out objects that will work with composition in mind. So sort of thinking about scale, but of course I can manipulate that. So that's not that big a constraint. But I think that it was really about these markers in time that, for someone like me who lived through the time where that was the way you kept music and you felt pretty sophisticated having these cassette tapes. That's a particular marker of time that's now lost, and very it's either sentimental, those of us who still remember and want to keep our mixed tapes. So that was sort of the process of the decision, and then also just the feeling of things unwinding and unraveling. And I don't think, given the week or the month that we've seen, I probably don't need to say so much more, except for to say, again, historically, as you look through time, I think everyone's feeling their times are unraveling. Like, this might be a persistent human condition. It's just that sometimes it's more acute in a concerted discourse than other times.
Absolutely. Yeah, thanks for sharing a little bit of that. That's an interesting process to get there. And then, of course, that's part of the beauty of the creative process. When we look back on it, we can describe all kinds of different meanings that obviously weren't intentional, but they do resonate, and that's part of the nature of this whole thing. So, yeah, at the moment, that definitely makes sense as an interpretation looking back on it, but obviously it wasn't specifically in your creative process. But like you mentioned, yeah, that's part of the human condition.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, that's great. So I think that'll do it. We'll put that image threshold on the website. So if you are listening to this, it'll be right below, so you can take a peek at it. But otherwise, thanks for joining me.
Well, thank you. I mean, first, thank you for the opportunity to show my work in such a just stellar venue, and then thanks for taking the time to talk to me. I love to also hearing a little bit. I want to hear more. I'll keep listening to the podcast to hear more and more of your secrets revealed in the digital world. But yeah.
Sure. Yeah, I got to save something for next episode, so I don't want to give it all away. But yeah, absolutely. We'll talk to everybody later.
Okay. Thank you.